The crystal chandeliers of the grandeur estate cast a warm golden glow over 300 of the city's most elite guests. I sat quietly at a small, wobbly table tucked away near the swinging kitchen doors. I watched my younger sister Sierra laughing radiantly at the sweetheart table with her new wealthy in-laws. I am Maya, 35 years old, and a self-made venture capitalist. I raised Sierra entirely on my own after our mother passed away when I was only 15. I worked 3 exhausting jobs, sacrificed my own youth, and built a silent luxury hospitality portfolio from the ground up just to make sure she never had to struggle. Yet here I was, shoved into a dark corner at her wedding reception, treated like an unwanted secret. The soft jazz music playing in the background was abruptly broken by the heavy, deliberate footsteps of Harrison Cole Sierra's new father-in-law. Harrison was a man who wore his old money arrogance like a perfectly tailored suit, though I knew for a fact his pockets were completely empty. He marched directly up to my table, reached into his expensive jacket, and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. Without a single word of greeting, he dropped the money right into my crystal glass of champagne. I watched the green paper float among the rising bubbles as the few guests sitting nearby fell dead silent. Harrison leaned in close, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. He told me to grab my dinner plate and head to the kitchen immediately. He loudly declared that the catering staff had extra chairs in the back and that an actual important investor needed my seat. He smirked as if he was doing me a generous favor by tossing me a 20 for my humiliation. I did not blink, and I certainly did not cry. I simply reached into the glass, pulled out the soaked bill, and placed it flat on the pristine white tablecloth. I looked Harrison dead in the eye, my voice perfectly steady, and asked him a very simple question. I asked if he had any earthly idea who actually owned the multi-million-dollar estate he was currently standing in. Harrison's arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he let out a dry, mocking laugh ready to call me crazy. But before the words could leave his mouth, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open. The general manager of the estate walked briskly toward our table, flanked by 2 towering security guards in immaculate dark suits. The manager completely ignored Harrison. He stopped right beside my chair, bowed his head respectfully, and asked if everything was to my liking, addressing me clearly and loudly as Madam CEO. I watched in absolute satisfaction as every single ounce of color instantly drained from Harrison's face. His smug smile vanished completely, replaced by a pale, trembling realization that he had just publicly humiliated the very woman who held his entire financial future in the palm of her hand. Before I tell you exactly how this man lost his entire real estate empire, his reputation, and his precious family legacy in a single night, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you have ever had to stand your ground against a toxic bully who tried to make you feel small, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You are going to want to hear every single detail of this spectacular downfall. To truly understand how we reached this explosive moment, I have to take you back to where the disrespect truly began. It was Friday evening, just 24 hours earlier, at the exclusive country club where the rehearsal dinner was being held. The air was crisp, and I had arrived hoping to celebrate the sister I practically raised. Instead, I was met with a barricade. I walked up to the grand entrance, but the security guard immediately stepped in front of me, holding up a heavy hand. He informed me coldly that my name had been intentionally left off the VIP family guest list. I stood there on the pristine marble foyer, staring at the clipboard in the security guard's hand. He tapped his silver pen against the laminated paper, completely unbothered by my shock. I asked him to check the list one more time. I explained that I was the sister of the bride, the only biological family member she had in the world, and there had to be some sort of clerical mistake. He did not even bother looking down at the paper again. He just shook his head, stepped firmly into my path, and gestured vaguely toward the lobby waiting area. He suggested I take a seat on the velvet bench near the coat check, while he tried to track down a banquet manager to verify my identity. The absolute humiliation washed over me like a wave of ice water. I walked over to the designated waiting area, feeling the curious eyes of passing country club members lingering on my emerald dress. I pulled my phone from my clutch and dialed Sierra's number. It went straight to voicemail. I typed out a quick text message explaining that security was holding me at the front entrance and asking her to come clear things up. My screen illuminated with a read receipt almost instantly. I waited for the typing bubble to appear, but the screen just faded to black. No reply came. I sat on that velvet bench for 45 excruciating minutes. It was 45 minutes of listening to the muffled sounds of clinking crystal glasses and raucous laughter spilling from the heavy mahogany doors at the end of the hall. Every time a waiter pushed through those doors to bring out another silver tray of appetizers, I caught glimpses of the rehearsal dinner I was supposed to be attending. I saw the opulent floral centerpieces and the warm glow of candlelight reflecting off the mirrored walls. I saw Beatrice Cole Julian's mother holding court at the center of the room, with her diamond tennis bracelets catching the light as she gestured wildly. I saw Julian pouring an expensive vintage wine for his groomsmen, smiling comfortably. Most agonizing of all, I saw my sister. I saw the girl whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose high school tuition I had paid by working late nights, analyzing financial models until my eyes burned. Sierra was sitting right in the middle of it all, radiant and laughing loudly at a joke Beatrice had just told. She was not looking toward the door. She was not checking her phone to see if her only sister had made it safely inside. She was simply eating her gourmet salad, completely oblivious to my absence. Or perhaps she was entirely indifferent to it. She was so desperate for the validation of this old money family that she was perfectly willing to pretend I did not exist. Just as I was about to gather whatever pride I had left and walk back out into the crisp evening air, the heavy glass front doors swung open. Malik strode into the lobby. Malik is my chief operating officer, my most trusted strategist in the venture capital world, and my designated +1 for the weekend. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carried his signature black leather briefcase, moving with a quiet authority that immediately demanded attention. He took one look at me sitting by the coat check, then glanced at the guarded hallway, and pieced the situation together instantly. Malik does not do small talk, and he absolutely does not tolerate disrespect toward me. He walked over, his sharp gaze assessing my expression. I quietly told him what had happened. I explained that Sierra was sitting inside having dinner, and the Cole family had deliberately excluded my name from the guest list to keep me out of sight. Malik simply nodded. He did not waste his breath arguing with the security guard at the door. Instead, he pulled out his phone and made a single phone call. He bypassed the club management entirely and dialed the personal cell phone of the country club owner. This was a man whose latest massive commercial real estate project, our venture capital firm, had just aggressively funded. I sat quietly and listened as Malik spoke in low, measured tones. He calmly mentioned that the CEO of his largest financial backing firm was currently being treated like a common trespasser near the coat check by an overzealous bouncer. The phone call lasted less than 60 seconds. Within 3 minutes, the heavy mahogany doors at the end of the hall swung open rapidly. The club's general manager practically sprinted down the corridor, his face flushed with sheer panic. He bypassed the security guard entirely and rushed straight to where Malik and I were standing. He offered a frantic flurry of apologies, his hands trembling slightly as he bowed his head. He assured me there had been a terrible administrative oversight regarding the guest list, and begged me to follow him into the private dining room immediately. The security guard suddenly looked terrified, shrinking back against the wall as we walked right past him. I stepped through those heavy doors, with my head held high, Malik walking firmly by my side. The private dining room was even more breathtaking up close, filled with sprawling white orchids and walls lined with rare vintage wines. But my eyes were fixed solely on the head table. The loud conversation in the room began to quiet down as people finally noticed my entrance. I walked slowly toward the front, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor, commanding the attention of every wealthy guest in the room. Sierra finally looked up from her plate. For a brief second, a flash of genuine panic crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with a forced, practiced smile. She did not stand up to greet me or hug me. She did not offer a single word of apology for leaving me stranded out in the cold foyer. She simply patted an empty chair at the very end of the table, positioned as far away from the Cole family as physically possible, and told me I was late. I looked at Julian, her soon-to-be husband, who was suddenly very interested in the rim of his water glass, avoiding my gaze entirely. I looked at Harrison and Beatrice Cole, who shared a silent, intensely annoyed glance. They had orchestrated this entire scenario. They had deliberately manipulated the guest list to orchestrate my exclusion, hoping I would just quietly slip away in shame and spare them the embarrassment of acknowledging my existence among their elite friends. But what stung the most was not the Coles and their blatant racism and classism. It was Sierra. She sat there wrapped in a silk designer dress I had paid for, seamlessly blending into a family that openly despised her roots. She was actively participating in the erasure of the woman who had sacrificed everything to get her to this exact table. I pulled out the chair at the far end of the table and sat down, slowly smoothing my dress. Malik took the seat next to me, placing his briefcase near his feet. The silence in the room was thick and suffocating. I did not touch the food a nervous waiter quickly placed in front of me. I just watched them all settling in for the long evening ahead, knowing full well that I held the power to destroy their entire fake empire whenever I decided the time was right. The waiter had barely cleared our appetizer plates when Harrison Cole decided it was the perfect moment to command the room. He stood up slowly at the center of the head table, picking up his crystal champagne flute and tapping a silver spoon against the delicate glass. The sharp, clear ringing sound echoed through the private dining room, instantly silencing the low hum of wealthy conversations. Everyone turned their attention to the patriarch of the Cole family. Harrison adjusted the lapels of his custom Italian suit, plastered a benevolent paternal smile across his face, and raised his glass toward his son and my sister. He began his toast with the usual hollow pleasantries, praising the beautiful venue and thanking his elite friends for making the journey to celebrate this momentous occasion. But then his tone shifted. It dropped into a slow, theatrical cadence dripping with a sickening blend of pity and arrogance. He placed a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder and looked out at the audience of country club members. He announced that he was incredibly proud of his son tonight, not just for becoming a man, but for showing such a remarkably big heart. Harrison stated that it took a truly noble man to look past social standing and pedigree. He loudly declared that Julian was performing an act of pure grace by reaching down and rescuing a girl like Sierra from her rough urban background. The words hung in the air like thick smoke. Harrison went on practically painting a tragic fictional movie scene for his friends. He praised Sierra for surviving what he called the insurmountable odds of fatherless inner-city poverty. He called her a modern-day Cinderella who had finally been saved from a life of struggle and broken homes, all thanks to the endless generosity and open arms of the Cole family legacy. A collective sympathetic murmur washed over the room. A few of Beatrice Cole's wealthy friends literally pressed their hands over their hearts, nodding with absolute approval at Julian's supposed charity. I sat at the far end of the table, my blood turning into ice water. I looked directly at Sierra, waiting for her to correct him. I waited for her to awkwardly laugh, shake her head, and set the record straight. Instead, Sierra looked down at her lap, her cheeks flushed, and offered a shy, nervous giggle. She actually nodded in agreement. She leaned her head against Julian's arm, playing the exact role of the tragic, helpless victim they wanted her to be. She was actively soaking up their false sympathy, perfectly willing to erase our mother's memory and my entire existence just to secure her spot in their pretentious world. I did not wait for Harrison to finish his toast. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor, a harsh sound that immediately sliced through the polite applause. Every head in the room snapped in my direction. Malik leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, a subtle smirk playing on his lips as he watched me stand up. I did not raise my voice, but I projected it with the practiced authority of a woman who commands boardrooms for a living. I walked slowly down the length of the long table, my eyes locked dead onto Harrison Cole. I told him that I hated to interrupt such a touching fairy tale, but I felt absolutely compelled to clarify the narrative. Harrison lowered his champagne glass, his benevolent smile freezing into a tight, confused grimace. Beatrice Cole's posture went completely rigid. I stopped just a few feet away from the head table, making sure my voice carried to the very back of the private dining room. I looked at the crowd and informed them that Sierra had never spent a single day of her life in poverty, nor did she need any rescuing. I stated clearly that our mother was a brilliant nurse who owned her own home, and when she passed away, I made sure Sierra never felt the financial void of that loss. I turned my gaze back to Harrison. I told him that while he was busy imagining my sister dodging hardships on some fictional street corner, she was actually taking private equestrian lessons and attending an elite preparatory academy. I took another step closer, my tone sharpening into a blade. I made sure every single person in that room heard me when I explained that Sierra's pristine debt-free college degree was not the result of a miracle. It was the result of me working 3 agonizing jobs. I spent my early 20s waitressing until 2 in the morning, doing data entry at dawn and tutoring college students on the weekends so my sister could wear the exact same designer labels as the girls in this very country club. I looked directly into Sierra's eyes, watching the color drain entirely from her face. I told the room that there was absolutely nothing rough or tragic about her background, because her entire life of luxury had been meticulously funded by my blood, my sweat, and my complete sacrifice. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. You could have heard a single pin drop on the thick carpets. The wealthy guests who had just been cooing with sympathy were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging wide-eyed, embarrassed glances. The beautiful tragic illusion Harrison had just painted was completely shattered, replaced by the uncomfortable reality of a fiercely independent black woman standing in their space refusing to be diminished. Harrison stood completely frozen, his mouth slightly open, the champagne flute trembling just a fraction of an inch in his hand. He had expected me to cower in the corner, grateful just to be allowed inside the building. He had never anticipated being publicly corrected and humiliated in front of his most important business associates. Beatrice Cole was the first to react. She slammed her crystal water glass down onto the table with a sharp crack, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. She glared at me as if I were a stain on her pristine white tablecloth. She despised my confidence. She was absolutely enraged by my refusal to bow my head and play the role of the quiet, grateful charity case they could parade around to make themselves feel like saviors. She leaned over to Harrison and aggressively whispered something into his ear, her eyes never leaving my face. Sierra looked absolutely terrified. She shrunk back into her chair, her hands trembling in her lap, utterly incapable of defending herself or me. She looked at Julian silently, pleading with him to fix the uncomfortable tension that had swallowed the room. Julian's face was bright red. He looked around at the staring guests, swallowed hard, and finally decided to act. He abruptly stood up, threw his linen napkin onto his plate, and quickly walked around the table toward me. His jaw was clenched tight, and the look in his eyes was a mixture of panic and deep-seated anger. He did not say a word to the crowd. He simply grabbed my elbow in a tight, frantic grip and aggressively steered me away from the dining room, pulling me toward the secluded hallway outside. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung shut behind us, instantly muffling the suffocating tension we had just left behind. Julian released his grip on my elbow the second we were out of sight of his parents' wealthy friends. The secluded corridor was lined with vintage oil paintings and dimly lit sconces, a sharp contrast to the bright, glaring reality of what was happening. I adjusted the sleeve of my emerald dress, staring at the man my sister had chosen to marry. I expected him to apologize, I expected him to look at me with some shred of embarrassment for the vile classist fairy tale his father had just spun at Sierra's expense. Instead, Julian let out an exasperated sigh, running a hand through his perfectly styled blonde hair. He looked at me not with remorse, but with profound annoyance. He accused me of deliberately trying to sabotage his family on the most important weekend of his life. He claimed I was being overly sensitive and dramatically inflating a harmless toast just to steal the spotlight from my younger sister. His sheer audacity was almost impressive. He stood there, a mediocre man, propped up entirely by his father's crumbling legacy, attempting to gaslight the very woman who could dismantle his entire reality with a single phone call. I calmly told Julian that there was absolutely nothing harmless about erasing a black woman's hard work to make a room full of old money socialites feel charitable. I warned him that if his family ever disrespected my mother's memory or my sacrifices again, I would do a lot more than just interrupt a toast. Julian scoffed. He reached over to a nearby high-top table where a passing waiter had momentarily rested a silver tray of drinks. Julian picked up a bourbon on the rocks, took a slow sip and set it back down. Then he reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a crisply folded stack of papers. It was not an itinerary. It was not a heartfelt letter of reconciliation. It was a formal, legally binding document. He thrust the thick stack of papers toward my chest, demanding I take them. I glanced down at the bold, capitalized heading, printed across the top page. It was a non-disclosure agreement. I looked back up at Julian, my expression hardening into stone. I asked him if he had completely lost his mind. He took another sip of his bourbon and completely dropped his polite, charming groom persona. The mask fell, revealing the exact same arrogant entitlement his father possessed. Julian coldly explained that his parents had instructed their corporate lawyers to draft this agreement specifically for me earlier that afternoon. He stated that tomorrow's wedding was not just a celebration. It was a highly curated networking event. His father had invited several critical high-net-worth investors, and the Cole family could not afford any unpredictable variables ruining their carefully constructed aesthetic. Julian looked me up and down with blatant disgust. He told me that my little outburst in the dining room had confirmed their worst fears. He actually used the words ghetto tendencies. He said his mother was terrified that my urban behavior and my aggressive need to discuss my working-class background would alienate their elite guests. He demanded I sign the document immediately. The clauses were absurd. The agreement strictly forbade me from mentioning my upbringing, my mother's death, or the multiple jobs I worked to support Sierra. Furthermore, it required me to agree to a fabricated backstory. If any of the country club members asked what I did for a living, I was legally obligated to tell them I was a quiet, mid-level administrative assistant at a local logistics firm. They wanted to put a legal gag order on my trauma, my heritage, and my financial success, all so they could comfortably parade my sister around as their grateful charity project, without the inconvenient truth standing in the way. I asked Julian if Sierra knew about this document. Julian smirked, swirling the ice in his glass. He proudly confirmed that Sierra had been sitting right next to him in his father's home office when the lawyer drafted it. He claimed Sierra completely agreed that I was a liability. According to Julian, Sierra understood that making sacrifices was part of marrying into American royalty, and she was more than willing to sacrifice my dignity to secure her new last name. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. The pain instantly hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I realized in that exact moment that Sierra was not a victim being held hostage by this family. She was a willing participant. She had traded her loyalty for a diamond tennis bracelet and a front-row seat at a country club she did not even belong to. Julian pulled a sleek silver pen from his pocket and clicked it open. He extended it towards me, instructing me to sign on the dotted line so we could all go back inside and pretend none of this happened. He promised that if I behaved like a civilized guest tomorrow, his father might even introduce me to some low-level managers who could get me a better administrative job. I took the pen from his hand. I took the heavy stack of legal papers. For a brief second, a triumphant, smug smile spread across Julian's face. He truly believed he had won. He truly believed that his last name and his tailored suit had intimidated me into submission. He thought I was just a desperate poor sister clinging to the coattails of his family's wealth, easily bullied by a piece of paper. I did not sign the document. I looked him dead in the eye, my face devoid of any emotion, and I gripped the top of the thick paper. With one swift, forceful motion, I ripped the entire stack of legal documents directly in half. The loud sound of tearing thick parchment echoed sharply in the quiet hallway. Julian flinched, his smug smile instantly vanishing. He opened his mouth to shout, but before he could form a single word, I placed the two halves together and ripped them again, turning his father's pathetic legal threat into quarters. I stepped forward, invading his personal space, forcing him to take a step back until his hip hit the high-top table. I held the shredded, useless pieces of paper over his glass of bourbon. I let go. The ripped pieces of the non-disclosure agreement fluttered down, landing directly in his drink, soaking up the amber liquid and sinking to the bottom of the crystal glass. I tossed his expensive silver pen onto the tray, letting it clatter loudly against the wood. I leaned in close, ensuring my voice was low, dangerous, and absolutely unwavering. I told him to tell his father that I do not sign contracts with men who cannot even afford to pay their own floral vendors. I stepped back, smoothing the front of my emerald dress with perfect composure. I gave Julian one last look of absolute pity, smiled coldly, and told him I would see him at the altar. I turned on my heel and walked away. Malik was waiting for me near the lobby entrance, leaning casually against a marble pillar. He had clearly watched the entire exchange from a distance. As I approached, he handed me my coat and simply asked if the corporate acquisition timeline needed to be accelerated. I nodded, pulling the coat over my shoulders. I told Malik that we were no longer just acquiring the Cole family real estate empire. We were going to dismantle it brick by brick, right in the middle of their perfect aesthetic wedding. I walked out the heavy glass doors of the country club and into the cool Friday night air. The valet brought my car around, and as I slid into the leather seat, I did not look back at the grand building. Tomorrow was Saturday. Tomorrow was the wedding. And tomorrow I was going to give Sierra and her new family exactly what they asked for. I was going to show them exactly what my background had taught me about survival, and I was going to do it in front of every single high-net-worth investor they were desperately trying to impress. Saturday morning broke with a bright, mocking sunshine that poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. I stood alone before the full-length mirror, securing my hair and smoothing the fabric of my emerald green dress. My mind was a calm, calculated fortress. Despite the viciousness of the previous night, despite Julian trying to gag me with a legal contract, and his parents treating me like a stray dog, I had one final sacred duty to perform. I am a woman who honors her promises. On her deathbed, holding my trembling teenage hands, our mother had made me swear that I would always watch over Sierra. I had promised her that I would be there on the most important days of Sierra's life. I intended to keep that promise, even if the sister I had raised no longer wanted me there. I walked over to the hidden wall safe in my bedroom, entered the code, and withdrew a small, faded navy blue velvet box. The velvet was worn smooth at the corners from years of being carefully handled. Inside lay a single elegant strand of vintage pearls. They were not flawless, and they certainly did not cost a fortune, but they were the only piece of jewelry our mother had managed to leave behind. I had guarded these pearls with my life. During our darkest years, when the electricity was shut off and I was eating plain rice so Sierra could afford to go on her private school field trips, I had flatly refused to pawn them. They were meant for this exact day. They were the physical embodiment of a mother's love preserved through poverty and sacrifice. I drove across the city to the Grandeur Estate, the sprawling venue I secretly owned, and made my way up the grand sweeping staircase to the master bridal suite. The heavy mahogany double doors were propped wide open, spilling the sounds of excessive laughter and popping champagne corks out into the quiet hallway. I took a deep breath, clutching the velvet box in my hand, and stepped inside. The scent of expensive hairspray, imported white lilies, and spilled citrus mimosas hit me immediately. The massive suite was a chaotic, dizzying whirlwind of white silk robes, overflowing designer garment bags, and a small army of makeup artists buzzing around like frantic worker bees. Bridesmaids I did not recognize, girls from Sierra's wealthy sorority days who had never once stepped foot in our childhood home, were lounging on plush sofas and taking selfies. Right in the center of the room, perched on a tufted velvet chaise lounge, sat Sierra. She was draped in a luxurious silk robe with the word bride embroidered in glittering silver thread across the back. Two makeup artists were carefully contouring her cheekbones, while a hairstylist meticulously pinned up her intricate curls. She looked absolutely breathtaking. She also looked completely unbothered. There was no trace of guilt on her face regarding the country club incident. She was entirely absorbed in her own reflection, basking in the attention of her hired entourage. I carefully navigated through the maze of discarded shoeboxes and steaming equipment until I stood right beside her chair. Sierra caught my eye in the bright vanity mirror. Her practiced, radiant smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, her shoulders tensing defensively before she quickly regained her composure. She did not bother to turn around to face me. She just stared at my reflection and offered a stiff, formal greeting, as if I were a distant acquaintance who had wandered into the wrong room. I did not bring up the rehearsal dinner. I did not mention the torn non-disclosure agreement currently sitting at the bottom of a bourbon glass. I simply wanted to give her the blessing our mother could not. I opened my clutch, pulled out the worn navy blue velvet box, and gently popped the lid open. The pearls caught the harsh glare of the bright vanity ring lights, glowing with a soft, milky warmth. I kept my voice low and tender. I told Sierra that Mom had always wanted her to wear these on her wedding day. I explained that it was our family tradition, a piece of our history, and that I was incredibly proud to finally pass them down to her so a part of our mother could walk her down the aisle. The entire room seemed to suddenly freeze. The loud, bubbling conversations died abruptly. The makeup artist paused, holding a blending brush suspended midair. The hairstylist took a cautious step back. Sierra finally turned away from the mirror to look directly at me. She did not reach out with trembling hands to touch the pearls. She did not shed a sentimental tear. Instead, she physically recoiled. Her nose crinkled in absolute unfiltered disgust, her eyes darting frantically to the bridesmaids watching from the sofa. Sierra let out a sharp, condescending scoff that sliced through the quiet hum of the room. She loudly declared that there was absolutely no way she was putting those old yellowed beads anywhere near her custom designer gown. She snapped her manicured fingers, instructing the makeup artist to move out of the way, and aggressively held up her left wrist. A massive, ostentatious diamond tennis bracelet sparkled blindly under the lights. She puffed out her chest and proudly announced that Beatrice Cole, her new mother-in-law, had personally sent a courier to deliver those diamonds to the suite this morning. Sierra actually used the words "old money aesthetic." She claimed Beatrice's gift perfectly fit the sophisticated high society vibe of the wedding, whereas our mother's pearls just looked incredibly sad and cheap. She said the pearls screamed working class, and she was leaving that life behind forever. I stood completely still, holding our mother's only legacy out to her, absorbing the sheer cruelty of her words. But Sierra was not finished. She did not just politely decline the necklace. She reached up, grabbed the top of the open velvet box, and forcefully shoved it back into my chest. The hard edge of the box dug painfully into my collarbone. She raised her voice, making sure every single person in the room heard her clearly. She demanded that I put the cheap jewelry away immediately before the wedding videographer walked in and captured something so embarrassing on camera. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure disdain, claiming that forcing her to wear something so blatantly poor would be a complete embarrassment to her new social standing. She told me I was ruining her aesthetic and ordered me to go sit quietly in the back until the ceremony started. The room was dead silent. The glam squad and the wealthy bridesmaids were all staring at me with a mixture of pity and secondhand embarrassment, waiting to see if I would break down in tears or cause a screaming scene. But I did not feel humiliated. I did not feel the sting of rejection. In that exact moment, watching the sister I had starved for sneer at the very pearls our mother cherished, something fundamental inside of me simply shifted. The final fraying thread of my unconditional sisterly devotion cleanly snapped. The little girl I had raised was gone. She had been entirely consumed by this hollow, greedy stranger who worshipped status over blood. I looked down at the pearls completely unharmed, and then back up at Sierra's furious, entitled face. I calmly closed the lid of the velvet box with a sharp, decisive click. I slipped it safely back into my emerald clutch. My voice did not shake. I looked her dead in the eye and agreed with her. I told her she was absolutely right. The pearls were far too valuable to be worn by a woman who had no concept of their true worth. I turned my back on her without another word, walking out of the suite, my resolve to dismantle the Cole family empire, now completely unbreakable. I had barely taken 3 steps toward the heavy mahogany double doors to exit the suite when they suddenly burst open, nearly striking my shoulder. The lead floral designer practically collided with me, his face flushed red, and a sheer layer of sweat glistening on his forehead. He was a frantic bundle of nervous energy, clutching a sleek silver iPad in one hand and a wireless credit card reader in the other. Behind him, I could see 2 of his assistants hovering anxiously in the hallway, holding massive buckets of white orchids and imported hydrangeas that were meant for the ceremony. He bypassed me completely, his eyes darting frantically around the chaotic bridal suite until they landed on my sister. He marched straight toward the center of the room, his voice loud and trembling with a mixture of panic and severe frustration. He announced to the entire room that he had officially ordered his crew to halt the installation of the grand floral arches at the botanical garden altar. The loud buzzing of the glam squad instantly died. The makeup artist slowly lowered her contour brush, stepping away from the vanity. Sierra spun around in her tufted velvet chair, her silk robe slipping slightly off her shoulder. She glared at the designer, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the armrests. She demanded to know what he was talking about, reminding him sharply that the ceremony was only a few hours away, and the aesthetic of the altar was the absolute centerpiece of her wedding photography. The floral designer did not back down from her bridezilla tone. He tapped the screen of his iPad aggressively and held it up for her to see. He stated that his contract clearly stipulated the final $5,000 balance must be cleared before the premium installations were erected. His crew had been working since dawn, and the most delicate flowers were currently sitting in an unair-conditioned delivery truck. He looked directly at Sierra and declared that Harrison Cole's platinum credit card had just declined. Sierra let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, looking around at her wealthy bridesmaids, who were suddenly exchanging very interested, wide-eyed glances. These were the exact girls Sierra had spent months bragging to about the immense, untouchable wealth of the Cole family empire. She waved her hand dismissively, telling the florist that it was obviously just a bank fraud alert. She claimed that Harrison made such massive corporate real estate transactions daily that his bank probably flagged a sudden floral charge as suspicious. She instructed the designer to simply run the card again and stop causing an unnecessary scene. The designer shook his head firmly. He told her he had already run the platinum card 3 separate times. He had even called the merchant services hotline to verify the issue because he wanted to get his crew back to work. The bank did not place a fraud hold on the account. They explicitly stated there were insufficient funds. Harrison Cole's account was completely maxed out, and the card was now frozen. The silence in the bridal suite became thick, heavy, and incredibly suffocating. The facade of old money royalty was suddenly cracking right in front of Sierra's elite sorority sisters. Real panic finally set in. Sierra frantically looked around the room as if expecting Beatrice or Julian to magically appear from behind a garment bag to hand over a stack of cash and fix the situation. But she was completely alone with the bill. Her eyes darted wildly before finally locking onto me standing quietly near the doorway. The sheer, unfiltered entitlement that washed over her face was almost breathtaking to witness. The panic instantly morphed into a fierce, demanding expectation. Sierra stood up from her chair, her custom silk robe billowing behind her, and marched directly across the room toward me. She did not lower her voice to keep the matter private. She did not ask for a sisterly favor. She pointed a shaking finger at my emerald clutch and ordered me to take out my credit card to pay the vendor immediately. I looked at her outstretched hand, then up to her furious eyes. I calmly asked her why she thought it was my responsibility to pay for her new family's lavish floral arrangements. Sierra scoffed, rolling her eyes as if I were being intentionally dense. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and yelled that I had always been her provider. She loudly broadcasted to the room that I was the one who paid for her private school tuition, her designer prom dresses, and her expensive college textbooks. She claimed it was my fundamental duty as her older sister to step up and handle the finances, so her perfect day would not be ruined by a simple bank error. She actually told me to stop being stubborn, open my purse, and just do my job. I stared at the woman I had sacrificed my entire youth to raise. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my voice steady, and my expression completely devoid of the hurt she was desperately trying to inflict. I told Sierra that my financial obligations to her ended the exact moment she decided to trade our family heritage for a fabricated high society aesthetic. I stated clearly and firmly that I would absolutely not subsidize Harrison Cole's fake wealth. I suggested that if her new in-laws were truly the untouchable American royalty they pretended to be, they could surely scrape together $5,000 to pay for their own party. That single, unwavering refusal was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Sierra completely lost whatever shred of composure she had left. Her face turned a blotchy, furious red. The poised, elegant bride persona vanished entirely, replaced by a vicious, unhinged tantrum. She stomped her foot against the hardwood floor and began screaming at me at the top of her lungs. She called me a bitter, jealous spinster. She shrieked that the only reason I was refusing to help her was because I was deeply envious of her incredible success. She pointed right at my face and yelled that I was 35 years old, completely alone, and trapped in a sad little administrative job, deliberately using the exact lie Julian had tried to force upon me the night before. Sierra screamed that I was intentionally sabotaging her wedding because I could not stand the fact that she was marrying into ultimate power, wealth, and prestige, while I had absolutely nothing to show for my miserable life. She accused me of trying to drag her back down to the pathetic working-class life I was stuck in. She shouted that I would die alone with my cheap vintage pearls entirely forgotten while she lived in absolute luxury. She claimed I was a toxic weight trying to hold her back from her true destiny. Every single insult was designed to strike at my deepest insecurities, to publicly humiliate me, and to punish me for daring to establish a boundary. The bridesmaids were frozen in shock, some physically shrinking back into the plush sofas to avoid her wrath. The makeup artists stood paralyzed against the vanity tables, holding their breath. The floral designer looked deeply uncomfortable, clutching his iPad to his chest, as if to shield himself from the pure venom spewing from the bride's mouth. I simply stood there and absorbed the screaming. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend my career or my relationship status. I just let her expose exactly who she had become to a room full of people she was desperately trying to impress. When Sierra finally ran out of breath, her chest heaving as she glared at me, the silence in the bridal suite was deafening. The only sound in the massive room was the faint hum of the air conditioning unit and the nervous shifting of the bridesmaids on the velvet sofas. Sierra stood with her hands on her hips, her chin raised high, wearing a triumphant smirk. She truly believed that her public temper tantrum had broken me. She thought that by humiliating me in front of her high society friends, I would shrink back into the obedient self, sacrificing older sister she had exploited for the last 10 years. She expected me to pull out my wallet in shame and apologize for disrupting her perfect morning. I did open my emerald clutch. I reached inside and pulled out a solid metal invitation, only black credit card. The moment the heavy card caught the light, Sierra let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of relief. She rolled her eyes at her bridesmaids, muttering something about how I always had to be dramatic before finally doing what I was told. She actually reached her hand out, expecting me to hand the card directly to her so she could play the wealthy bride paying her own vendors. I did not even look at her hand. I walked right past my sister, leaving her arm extended in the air, and approached the terrified lead floral designer. I held the heavy black card out to him. His hands were shaking slightly as he took it quickly, inserting the chip into his wireless reader. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke in a clear, commanding voice that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. I told him to process the $5,000 balance immediately, along with an automatic 20% tip for his installation crew. I made sure my voice carried across the dead quiet room. I explicitly stated that I was not paying this bill to save the aesthetic of a wedding that was built on lies. I told him I was paying this bill because I am a businesswoman who respects hard work, and I refuse to let a team of working-class vendors go unpaid simply because the fake old money family hosting this event cannot actually afford the lifestyle they are flaunting. The floral designer swallowed hard, nodding profusely. He handed the card back to me with both hands, thanking me with genuine, profound relief in his eyes. He did not say a single word to Sierra. He simply turned around, signaled his anxious assistants in the hallway, and practically sprinted toward the elevators to get his crew back to work. I turned slowly to face the room. Sierra was standing completely frozen, her mouth slightly open in sheer disbelief. The bridesmaids were now staring at her, not me, their eyes wide with poorly concealed judgment. I had just publicly exposed the fact that the untouchable Cole family could not even afford their own wedding flowers. I did not wait for Sierra to formulate another screaming response. I turned on my heel and walked out of the bridal suite, letting the heavy mahogany doors swing shut behind me. As soon as I stepped into the quiet, heavily carpeted corridor, the tension began to drain from my shoulders. The air out here was cool and smelled of expensive citrus room spray, a sharp contrast to the suffocating toxicity of the room I had just left. Before I could even reach the elevator bank, my phone vibrated sharply against the palm of my hand. I pulled it from my clutch and glanced at the screen. It was Malik. I answered on the first ring, pressing the phone to my ear as I walked toward a secluded sitting area near the floor-to-ceiling windows. I did not even have to say hello. Malik bypassed the pleasantries entirely, his voice vibrating with a sharp professional intensity. He told me that his forensic accounting team had stayed up the entire night, running a deep dive audit into Harrison Cole's commercial real estate development firm. I leaned against the cool glass window, looking out over the sprawling botanical gardens where the ceremony was scheduled to take place. I asked Malik for the bottom line. Malik let out a low, humorless chuckle. He informed me that the bottom line did not exist because the floor had completely fallen out. The results of the financial audit were absolutely catastrophic. Harrison Cole was not just experiencing a temporary cash flow problem, he was entirely fundamentally bankrupt. Malik broke down the numbers with brutal precision. Harrison had over-leveraged every single one of his properties to fund his lavish lifestyle. He was drowning in toxic debt, shuffling money between shell companies in a desperate attempt to hide his insolvency. 3 of his flagship commercial buildings were already quietly in the preliminary stages of foreclosure. His corporate credit lines were completely frozen, and his personal accounts were practically empty. I listened in silence as the pieces of the puzzle rapidly snapped together. The declined credit card for the florist was not a bank error. It was the frantic, dying gasp of a financial empire that had completely flatlined. But Malik was not finished. He told me there was one more piece of information, and it was the exact reason why the Cole family was throwing a wedding they could not afford. Malik explained that Harrison had been making desperate off-the-record phone calls all month to a highly exclusive private equity firm. He was begging for a massive multi-million-dollar corporate bailout to save his legacy from public ruin. Malik paused for a fraction of a second, the anticipation heavy in his voice. He told me the name of the private equity firm Harrison was targeting was Apex Holdings. A slow, icy chill spread through my veins, quickly followed by a rush of absolute clarity. Harrison Cole had structured this entire lavish weekend as a theatrical production. The country club rehearsal dinner, the botanical garden ceremony, the expensive champagne, it was all a desperate facade. He had invited the senior executives of Apex Holdings to the wedding reception tonight, hoping to use the grand display of wealth to convince them that his firm was prosperous and worthy of a massive financial lifeline. A cold, sharp smile spread across my face. I looked out the window at the pristine white chairs being set up on the manicured lawn below. Harrison Cole was waiting for the CEO of Apex Holdings to arrive tonight, completely unaware that he had just spent the last 24 hours viciously insulting her. He had no idea that the black woman he had intentionally excluded from the rehearsal dinner, the woman he had tried to silence with a non-disclosure agreement, was the sole founder and CEO of the exact company he was begging for mercy. I gripped the phone tightly. I told Malik that I wanted the legal department working immediately. I instructed him to draft the hostile takeover paperwork for Harrison Cole's entire portfolio. I wanted the debt purchased, the assets frozen, and the foreclosure proceedings accelerated. I told Malik to print the physical documents, place them in his leather briefcase, and bring them directly to the reception tonight. Malik did not hesitate. He simply confirmed the order, his tone reflecting the exact same predatory focus I felt. He told me the documents would be ready and ironclad before the cocktail hour even began. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my clutch. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, watching the morning sun illuminate the sprawling estate I owned. Sierra had called me a bitter spinster trying to sabotage her perfect life. Julian had called me a ghetto liability. Harrison had treated me like a stray dog begging for scraps at his table. They had all severely underestimated my worth. They had demanded that I learn my place in their world. And tonight, right in the middle of their perfect, curated aesthetic, I was going to gladly show them exactly where I stand. I took the private elevator down to the ground floor of the estate and stepped out onto the sprawling sunlit lawns of the botanical gardens. The afternoon air was warm and fragrant, carrying the scent of the thousands of white orchids I had just ensured would be installed. A string quartet was positioned near the grand stone fountain, playing a soft, sweeping classical melody that drifted over the gathering crowd. The ceremony space was truly breathtaking, a picture of absolute perfection. But as I walked down the curved stone path toward the seating area, I knew the perfection was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. Guests were already mingling near the entrance of the center aisle, the women wearing elaborate fascinators and the men in sharp, tailored suits. They were sipping sparkling water from crystal flutes, exchanging polite, hollow pleasantries. I smoothed the skirt of my emerald green dress, keeping my posture perfectly straight, and approached the main entry point. A young usher in a crisp black tuxedo immediately stepped directly into my path. He held a thick silver clipboard pressed tightly against his chest and offered me a rigid, highly practiced smile. He asked for my name. I looked at him and clearly stated that I was Maya Jackson, the biological sister of the bride. I watched the usher pull a silver pen from his pocket and begin scanning the perfectly typed pages on his clipboard. He checked the first page, which contained the VIP family seating. He did not find my name. He flipped to the second page, scanning the middle sections reserved for close friends and important corporate associates. Still nothing. Finally, he flipped to the very last page, his eyes darting to the absolute bottom margin. He swallowed hard, visibly uncomfortable, and cleared his throat. He did not make eye contact with me again. He simply gestured with his hand and told me to follow him. I expected him to lead me down the central white aisle toward the front. Instead, he directed me to the far outer edge of the seating arrangement, forcing me to walk along the grass boundary. We walked past the first 5 rows of plush cushioned chairs. Then we walked past the 10th row. We passed Julian's distant cousins, Harrison's regular golf partners, and even a group of junior analysts from Harrison's currently collapsing real estate firm. The usher kept walking his pace, quickening as if he wanted to get this humiliating task over with as fast as possible. We reached the absolute back edge of the ceremony space. The usher finally stopped and pointed to a single wobbly wooden folding chair. It was completely isolated from the main seating block. It was positioned partially behind a massive stone pillar, completely obstructing any clear view of the altar. Worse still, it was located uncomfortably close to the discreetly placed luxury portable restrooms meant for the outdoor event. The faint, undeniable smell of chemical deodorizer hung in the air right above my assigned seat. The usher quickly mumbled that this was my designated place for the ceremony, turned on his heel, and practically sprinted away before I could utter a single word of objection. I stood there for a long moment staring at the pathetic wooden chair. I was the silent owner of this entire multi-million-dollar property. I was the woman who had just paid the remaining balance for the massive floral arches standing proudly at the altar. Yet here I was, tucked away next to the restrooms like a dirty secret. I slowly sat down, resting my hands on my lap. I looked straight ahead, past the stone pillar, trying to get a view of the altar. The groom's side of the aisle was packed shoulder to shoulder. Harrison and Beatrice Cole were holding court in the very front row, acting like absolute royalty as they greeted their wealthy friends. They looked smug, completely secure in their false superiority. Then I shifted my gaze to the left side of the aisle, the bride's side. The breath caught in my throat, not out of sadness, but out of sheer, unfiltered shock. The entire first row on the bride's side, the seats traditionally reserved for the parents and immediate siblings, was completely empty. There were 4 beautiful chairs draped in delicate white silk ribbons. Each chair had a small, elegant, reserved placard resting on the seat. But there was absolutely no one sitting in them. Sierra had no other family in the world. Our parents were gone. We had no extended relatives we kept in touch with. I was the only family she had left. The truth hit me with a sickening crystalline clarity. Sierra had deliberately chosen to leave her family row entirely vacant. She knew that the expensive wedding videographers and high-end photographers would be capturing every single angle of the ceremony. She knew that having her dark-skinned, fiercely independent older sister sitting proudly in the front row would completely shatter the fragile, curated illusion she was trying to sell to the Cole family. She would rather project the image of a tragic, completely orphaned bride than proudly claim the woman who had sacrificed her entire youth to keep her fed, clothed, and educated. She believed that my presence, my lack of old money pedigree, and my refusal to shrink myself would ruin her pristine high society aesthetic. She wanted to erase me from the visual history of her life completely. She preferred the empty chairs over the reality of where she came from. A few years ago, this level of blatant, calculated rejection would have broken my spirit. I would have sat in this back row, hidden my face, and cried quietly while my sister married into a family that despised us. But as I sat there listening to the string quartet, I felt absolutely no urge to cry. The pain had entirely burned away, leaving behind a cold, indestructible armor. I looked at the empty chairs at the front of the aisle. I looked at Harrison Cole laughing loudly with a man who was likely a bank executive. I thought about the hostile takeover documents Malik was currently preparing inside the venue. Sierra and the Cole family had spent the entire weekend demanding that I learn my place. They wanted me silent, compliant, and invisible. I stood up from the wobbly wooden chair. I smoothed the fabric of my emerald dress one final time. I was not going to sit in the shadows by the restrooms while these absolute frauds paraded around on my property. If Sierra wanted a memorable, highly aesthetic wedding, I was going to make sure she got exactly what she paid for. I stepped away from the back row, turned my shoulders square toward the altar, and began walking directly up the main center aisle. Every step I took on that plush white carpet felt like a reclamation of my dignity. The string quartet was still playing a soft, sweeping classical melody, but the polite chatter around me began to rapidly die down. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the rows of guests as they noticed a disruption in their perfect, curated environment. I wore a bold emerald green silk dress that stood out starkly against the sea of muted beige blush and champagne tones the Cole family had strictly mandated for the guest dress code. I wore my natural hair proudly, a thick crown of coils that defied their suffocating Eurocentric standards. I did not look down, and I did not rush. I walked with the deliberate, measured pace of a woman who completely owns the ground she walks on. I reached the very front row on the left side of the aisle. The four empty chairs sat there wrapped in perfectly tied white silk ribbons, completely isolated from the rest of the crowd. I reached out, grasped the thick ribbon on the aisle seat and pulled. The expensive silk slipped away effortlessly, pooling onto the manicured grass. I picked up the small ivory card that read, "Reserved for Family," placed it carefully on the ground beside the chair, and sat down. I crossed my legs, smoothed the fabric of my emerald dress, and looked up at the altar. Sierra was standing directly under the massive floral arch I had just paid for 20 minutes ago. A professional photographer was practically laying on the grass, snapping rapid-fire portraits of her holding her cascading bouquet of white orchids. When the flash paused, and Sierra finally looked up, her eyes locked instantly onto me, sitting in the front row. The color completely drained from her face. The radiant, blushing bride persona dropped in a split second. She glared at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate panic. She aggressively jerked her head toward the back of the venue, mouthing the words, "Get out," with vicious intensity. She even took a half step forward, as if she were about to march down the aisle and physically drag me away from the camera's view herself. I did not break eye contact. I simply offered her a calm, completely unbothered smile, letting her know that I was absolutely not moving. Before Sierra could completely abandon her photo session, Beatrice Cole intercepted the situation. Beatrice had been mingling on the groom's side of the aisle, holding a glass of sparkling water and accepting compliments from her wealthy friends. But the moment she spotted my emerald dress in the reserved family row, she abandoned her conversation entirely. She marched across the center aisle, her sharp heels digging fiercely into the soft grass. Her face was flushed with a furious, blotchy red, completely ruining her own sophisticated aesthetic. She stopped right beside my chair, leaning down so her face was only a few inches from mine. She did not use a polite, socially acceptable whisper. She hissed through her perfectly veneered teeth. She demanded to know exactly what I thought I was doing. She pointed a trembling finger toward the back of the garden, reminding me that the usher had explicitly given me a designated seat out of the sightlines. Then Beatrice took it a step further. She looked me up and down with an expression of unfiltered, visceral disgust. She told me that my dress was aggressively loud and entirely inappropriate for a high society daytime ceremony. She criticized my natural hair, calling it unkempt, and demanding I go to the restroom immediately to tie it back so I would not look so aggressively urban in the background of their wedding video. She claimed I was deliberately trying to sabotage the carefully curated, muted aesthetic of the wedding photography because I was bitter about my own pathetic social standing. I let her finish her unhinged tirade. I did not shrink back from her pointed finger. I did not look down at my hands in shame. I stared directly into her pale blue eyes, absorbing the sheer audacity of this woman. It was almost comical. Here was a woman whose husband was secretly drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt, a woman whose credit cards were currently declining all over the city, trying to aggressively dictate my appearance on a multi-million-dollar property that I silently owned. I kept my voice incredibly low, perfectly steady, ensuring that only she and the terrified guests sitting immediately behind us could hear my response. I told Beatrice that I was the bride's only living family, and I would sit exactly where family belonged. I reminded her that my mother did not work herself into an early grave, so I could hide by the portable restrooms just to make a group of racist, classist frauds feel comfortable. Beatrice gasped loudly, her hand flying up to clutch the diamond necklace resting at her throat. Her eyes narrowed into tiny, furious slits. She leaned in closer and threatened to call the venue's security team to have me physically dragged off the property for trespassing. I smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was a cold, terrifying smile that completely unsettled her. I leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between us, and told her to go right ahead. I told her to call the security team. I told her to call the local police. I challenged her to make a massive screaming scene right here in the front row, exactly 5 minutes before her precious son was supposed to walk down the aisle. I dared her to explain to her elite corporate investors why she was having the bride's sister forcefully arrested over a seating arrangement. Beatrice froze completely. She looked around at the wealthy guests in the second and third rows, who were now openly staring at us, their polite conversations having completely stopped. She realized instantly that she was trapped in a corner of her own making. She could not follow through on her threat to drag me out without causing the exact type of low-class public spectacle she was so desperate to avoid. Her precious aesthetic would be ruined not by my green dress, but by her own uncontrollable rage. She stood upright slowly, her chest heaving with deep indignation. She shot me one final look of pure, concentrated hatred. She promised me in a shaky whisper that I would severely regret this blatant disrespect before the night was over. I simply gestured gracefully toward the groom's side of the aisle, inviting her to return to her seat. Beatrice turned sharply on her heel and retreated in a huff, practically stomping back to Harrison Cole's side. She sat down heavily, leaning into his ear and furiously whispering while pointing discreetly in my direction. Harrison looked over at me, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes burning with a silent promise of retaliation. I settled back into my chair, completely unfazed by their anger. I crossed my legs the other way and looked back toward the altar. Sierra had turned her back to me, refusing to look in my direction again as the groom's party began to line up. The ceremony was about to begin, and I had claimed my rightful place at the absolute front. I was ready to watch the entire theatrical production unfold, knowing perfectly well that the real show would begin the moment we stepped into the reception ballroom. The officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, and the polite manicured applause from the crowd washed over the botanical garden. Julian leaned in to kiss his new bride, and the string quartet immediately launched into a lively, upbeat classical recessional. As Sierra and Julian turned to walk back up the pristine white aisle, Sierra kept her eyes fixed rigidly straight ahead. She maintained her radiant, practiced smile for the cameras, but she completely avoided looking to her left. She marched right past me in the front row, entirely ignoring my existence, eager to transition into the next phase of her high society illusion. Once the bridal party cleared the aisle, the ushers began directing the guests toward the sprawling stone terraces for the cocktail hour. I stood up slowly, letting the sea of pastel dresses and tailored suits filter past me. The transition was seamless, exactly what you would expect from a massive budget wedding, but the atmosphere was completely wrong. As I walked onto the terrace, I noticed that people were not acting like family and friends celebrating a union. They were acting like corporate sharks circling a networking event. Waiters in crisp white uniforms weaved through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne and miniature crab cakes, but the guests were far more interested in exchanging business cards than toasting the newlyweds. I watched Harrison Cole from a distance. He was standing near the outdoor bar, holding a scotch on the rocks, aggressively cornering a man I recognized as a senior executive from a major commercial bank. Harrison was laughing entirely too loud, slapping the executive on the back with a forced familiarity that reeked of sheer desperation. Even from across the terrace, I could see the fine sheen of sweat glistening on Harrison's forehead. His custom Italian suit could not hide the frantic, erratic energy of a man who knew his financial empire was currently burning to the ground. I had absolutely no desire to make small talk with these people, so I navigated away from the crowded bar and walked toward the massive ornate stone fountains at the far edge of the terrace. The cascading water provided a steady, calming noise that muffled the obnoxious corporate chatter. I stood by the stone balustrade, looking out over the manicured hedges, mentally reviewing the hostile takeover documents Malik was finalizing inside. I did not hear Harrison approach over the sound of the rushing water, but I felt the sudden aggressive shift in the air. He had abandoned his banking executive to deal with what he clearly considered his biggest immediate problem. Harrison stepped right into my personal space, deliberately trapping me between his broad shoulders and the stone edge of the fountain. His face was flushed an angry mottled purple, completely stripping away the polished, benevolent patriarch persona he had worn at the altar. There were no cameras here. There were no wealthy investors within earshot. It was just the two of us, and Harrison finally let his true colors show. Without a single word of warning, he raised his hand and forcefully jabbed his thick index finger hard into my shoulder. The physical intrusion was jarring, a blatant and deeply disrespectful violation of my boundaries. It was the exact kind of physical intimidation arrogant men use when they want to make a woman feel small and helpless. He leaned in close, his breath reeking of expensive scotch and bitter anger. He told me that my little stunt in the front row was the absolute last time I would ever humiliate his family. He kept his voice to a vicious guttural whisper, completely convinced of his own untouchable authority. He threatened to signal his private security team right now and have them physically drag me off the property through the service exit exactly where he claimed a woman like me belonged. He jabbed his finger into my collarbone a second time to emphasize his point. He called me a toxic, low-class liability. He said I was a pathetic, jealous woman who was desperately trying to ruin Sierra's transition into a world I could never possibly comprehend. Harrison puffed out his chest and bragged that I had absolutely no idea how powerful the people in this venue were. He smugly declared that tonight's reception was going to host some of the most elite financial titans in the country, including an incredibly important guest of honor, who held the keys to the Cole family's continued dominance. He told me he would not allow a ghetto stain like me to ruin his aesthetic before the guest of honor even arrived. He was, of course, talking about the CEO of Apex Holdings. He was bragging to me about me entirely blinded by his own racism and classism. He truly believed I was just an administrative assistant clinging to my sister's coattails. I looked down at the thick finger currently pressed against the fabric of my emerald dress. Then I looked up into his bloodshot, furious eyes. I did not shrink back against the stone fountain. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not show him an ounce of the fear he was so desperately trying to provoke. I reached up and calmly clamped my hand around his wrist. My grip was absolute iron. I forcefully brushed his hand completely away from my body, shoving his arm back toward his chest, with a sharp, decisive motion that made him stagger back half a step. The utter shock on his face was immediate. He was a man who was entirely used to people cowering when he raised his voice. He had never experienced a woman, let alone a black woman, he viewed as entirely beneath him, physically rejecting his intimidation with such effortless authority. I stepped forward, closing the space he had just retreated from. I reached out and casually grabbed the knot of his expensive silk tie. I gave it a sharp, adjusting tug, smoothing the fabric down his chest in a move that was deeply patronizing. It was the exact gesture you would use to straighten the collar of an unruly, misbehaving child. I kept my voice soft-laced with a terrifying calm that made the blood drain from his face. I advised him to save his energy, keep his hands to himself, and go get a much stronger drink from the bar. I told him he was wasting his time threatening the wrong person because the real liability to his precious family legacy had not even walked through the front doors of the reception ballroom yet. Harrison stood completely paralyzed, his mouth open slightly but no words came out. He was trying to process what I meant, trying to figure out if I knew something about his crumbling business, but his staggering arrogance prevented him from seeing the truth standing right in front of him. He instinctively reached up to touch his perfectly straightened tie, looking at me as if he were suddenly staring at a ghost. I did not wait for him to recover his fake bravado. I turned my back on him and walked away from the fountain, leaving him standing there in the shadow of his own impending ruin. The cocktail hour was coming to an end, and the grand double doors of the reception ballroom were finally swinging open. I walked past the crowds of elite guests entirely focused on my destination. It was time to take my assigned seat by the kitchen, wait for Harrison to hand me the microphone and burn his entire empire to the ground. I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the cheap white tablecloth. The stark black ink across the top page read, "Final default and asset seizure." I ran my fingers over the smooth, heavy paper, feeling the absolute weight of what Malik had just delivered. I opened the folder to inspect the details. The first page outlined the immediate foreclosure of Harrison Cole's flagship commercial tower downtown. The second page detailed the aggressive acquisition of his completely frozen corporate credit lines. The third page was a direct transfer of his few remaining solvent assets to Apex Holdings to cover his massive outstanding debts. It was not just a financial correction. It was an absolute corporate execution, mathematically precise and completely inescapable. Malik leaned back in his creaky wooden chair, completely ignoring the fact that a waiter had just bumped into his shoulder while rushing through the swinging kitchen doors with a heavy tray of appetizers. He unbuttoned his tailored charcoal suit jacket and took a slow sip of the ice water from the table. He did not look angry about our insulting seating arrangement. If anything, he looked deeply amused. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and kept his voice low so the passing catering staff would not overhear us. He told me that his team had executed the plan flawlessly. Every single one of Harrison's terrified creditors had eagerly sold us his debt for pennies on the dollar, just to wash their hands of his rapidly sinking ship. Malik confirmed that, as of 1 hour ago, Apex Holdings officially owned Harrison Cole. Every brick, every property, and every single cent of his fake empire now belonged to me. I closed the folder, the soft thud of the heavy paper acting as a final gavel strike. I slipped the entire stack of documents back into Malik's leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut with a sharp, satisfying click. I turned my attention away from the paperwork and looked out over the sprawling grand ballroom. The grandeur estate had truly outdone itself tonight. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, expensive glow over the 300 guests. The guest tables were draped in heavy, imported silk, adorned with towering centerpieces of white orchids and rare roses. At the far end of the room, perched on an elevated stage to ensure everyone had to literally look up at them, was the sweetheart table. Sierra and Julian sat there looking like absolute royalty. Sierra was laughing at something Julian had just whispered in her ear, her massive diamond tennis bracelet catching the chandelier light as she raised her crystal champagne flute. She looked completely in her element, completely oblivious to the fact that her new husband was now legally tied to a mountain of toxic debt I controlled. She had traded my loyalty for a front-row seat on the Titanic, and the music was still playing loudly. My eyes scanned the elegant crowd, easily locating Harrison Cole. He was standing near the center of the polished wooden dance floor, aggressively dominating a conversation with two older men in expensive tuxedos. But his body language completely betrayed the confident, wealthy facade he was trying to project to his peers. He kept shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot. He adjusted his tie constantly, the exact same tie I had straightened for him out by the garden fountains. And most telling of all, he kept checking his gold watch. Every single time the heavy double doors of the ballroom opened to let in a late guest or a vendor, Harrison's head snapped toward the entrance, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate anticipation. He was waiting for his savior. He was waiting for the elusive CEO of Apex Holdings to arrive, witness this magnificent display of wealth, and hand him a multi-million-dollar corporate lifeline. He had no idea the person he was waiting for was sitting 30 feet away, watching him sweat next to the kitchen garbage bins. Malik noticed where my gaze was locked. He let out a dark, quiet laugh. He asked me how long I wanted to let Harrison sweat before we pulled the rug out from under him. I looked at the catering staff bringing out the first course. I told Malik I wanted to let him enjoy his dinner first. I wanted Harrison to savor every single bite of the expensive catering he could not actually afford. I wanted him to build his arrogant confidence up to the absolute peak, surrounded by his wealthy friends, so the inevitable fall would be that much more devastating. Our tiny table wobbled violently as another waiter backed through the swinging doors, nearly knocking over my water glass. The young waiter turned around, his face flushed red with sheer embarrassment, and quickly apologized. I gave him a warm smile and told him it was perfectly fine. I asked him his name and thanked him for his hard work tonight. The young man looked completely taken aback by the basic human decency. He had likely spent the entire evening being barked at and dismissed by the elite guests sitting in the center of the room. He thanked me quietly and hurried away to serve the next table. It was a stark, glaring reminder of exactly why I was doing this. The Cole family treated everyone they deemed beneath them like dirt on their expensive shoes. They had treated the floral designer like a nuisance. They treated the service staff like invisible machines, and they had treated me, the woman who funded Sierra's entire life, like a disease they needed to quarantine by the kitchen doors. I sat back in my chair and took a slow sip of my water. The room began to quiet down slightly as the gourmet dinner was served. The clinking of heavy silver cutlery against fine china filled the air. Nobody from the head tables looked in my direction. Beatrice Cole did not glance back to ensure her unwanted guest was behaving. Sierra did not scan the room to check on her older sister. They had successfully shoved me into the darkest, most undesirable corner of the room. They believed I was entirely out of sight, and therefore entirely out of mind. They believed they had won. They truly believed that their fake money, their borrowed status, and their cruel intimidation tactics had finally put me in my proper place. But they were looking at the entire situation backward. They had not pushed me into a corner. They had given me the absolute best vantage point in the entire room to watch their fragile empire collapse. The dinner service continued. Malik and I ate our meals in comfortable silence, the heavy leather briefcase resting safely against Malik's leg under the table. We were the predators sitting quietly in the tall grass, watching the oblivious prey parade themselves around the watering hole. The deep tension in my chest had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp focus. The emotional wounds Sierra had inflicted on me earlier that morning in the bridal suite no longer stung. They had scarred over entirely, leaving behind a woman completely unburdened by the obligations of toxic family loyalty. As the waiters began clearing the dinner plates and replacing them with delicate coffee cups, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted again. The low hum of polite conversation grew much louder, fueled by the endless flow of expensive vintage champagne. I watched Harrison Cole abruptly excuse himself from his table. He walked over to the bandstand, speaking quickly and aggressively to the panicked wedding planner. He was no longer just checking his watch. He was actively pacing. The guest of honor from Apex Holdings still had not arrived, and Harrison was clearly running out of time to make his grand impression before the night was over. He grabbed a wireless microphone from the audio technician and stepped firmly onto the center of the dance floor. He tapped the top of the microphone twice. The sharp, booming sound echoed through the massive ballroom, instantly cutting through the chatter. The live band stopped playing mid-note. 300 elite guests turned their attention toward the patriarch of the Cole family, waiting to hear what he had to say. Malik shifted in his chair, leaning slightly toward me. He did not take his eyes off Harrison. He quietly stated that the show was finally about to begin. I reached down, placing my hand briefly on the cool leather of Malik's briefcase, and nodded. I told Malik to get ready, because Harrison Cole was about to dig his own grave in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. Harrison's voice boomed through the high-end sound system, echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. He started with a long, self-indulgent monologue about the Cole family legacy. He spoke about his grandfather building neighborhoods, about their immense philanthropic efforts, and about the heavy burden of being pillars of the community. Every word was coated in a thick layer of self-importance. I watched him pace the polished wood of the dance floor, holding the microphone like a weapon. He was sweating profusely now, the harsh stage lights reflecting off his forehead. He turned toward the sweetheart table, extending a hand toward his son. He praised Julian for being a man of extraordinary character. Then, just as he had done at the rehearsal dinner, he weaponized my sister's past. He told the 300 elite guests that Julian had found a diamond in the rough. He painted a picture of Sierra as a helpless, destitute girl who had miraculously escaped a life of urban struggle, broken homes, and absolute despair. He called Julian a savior. He called their marriage an act of profound grace. I looked at Sierra. She was sitting on her elevated platform looking down at the crowd. She smiled softly, blushing, and leaned her head against Julian's shoulder. She was fully embracing the role of the rescued charity case. She was letting this man publicly humiliate our mother's memory and erase my entire existence, all for the illusion of belonging to a family that was secretly bankrupt. Harrison waited for the polite applause to die down. He took a sip from his water glass, his eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room one more time. Still no sign of the Apex Holdings executives. His anxiety was practically radiating across the room. He needed to assert his dominance. He needed to feel powerful in a room full of people who were about to realize he was a complete fraud. He scanned the crowd looking for an easy target to exert his control over. His eyes locked directly onto me sitting quietly at the tiny wobbly table squeezed right next to the kitchen doors. A cruel, predatory smile spread across his face. He brought the microphone back up to his mouth. He did not address me by name. Instead, he raised his hand and pointed a thick finger straight across the massive ballroom, directing the attention of every single guest right to my dark corner. He let out a loud, forced chuckle that echoed through the speakers. He announced to the crowd that despite spending thousands of dollars on private security, it seemed their perimeter was a bit lax tonight. He shook his head in mock disappointment. He told the room that it was a universal truth of high society. He said that no matter how high you build the walls, the help always manages to sneak in to steal a free meal. A few scattered uncomfortable chuckles rose from the tables closest to the dance floor, mostly from Harrison's sycophantic business partners, but the vast majority of the room fell dead silent. The blatant, aggressive racism and classism of the comments sucked the air right out of the room. People turned in their chairs, craning their necks, to see who the patriarch of the Cole family was publicly shaming. Harrison was not satisfied with just a verbal jab. He wanted a physical display of submission. He lowered the microphone, stepped off the polished dance floor, and began walking directly toward my table. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. The only sound was the heavy thud of Harrison's expensive leather shoes against the floor. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Malik shifted next to me, his jaw clenching so tight I could see the muscle ticking in his cheek. He instinctively reached for the brass locks of his briefcase, ready to end the charade right then and there. I quickly placed my hand over his wrist under the table, silently commanding him to wait. I wanted Harrison to dig the hole as deep as he possibly could. Harrison finally reached our table. He stood towering over me, his chest puffed out, radiating pure, unfiltered arrogance. He did not look at Malik. He only looked at me. He reached his hand into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and slowly pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. He did not offer it to me. He held it out over the center of the table directly above my crystal glass of vintage champagne. He let go of the paper. I watched the green bill flutter down, landing straight into the golden liquid. The paper instantly soaked through, fizzing slightly among the rising bubbles. Harrison leaned forward, resting both of his hands heavily on my table, causing it to wobble dangerously. He kept his voice just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear every single word. He told me that my little free ride was officially over. He commanded me to pick up my dinner plate and walk through the swinging kitchen doors immediately. He stated that he needed this table cleared right now because an extremely important investor was arriving any minute, and he absolutely refused to have a powerful corporate executive seated next to a ghetto liability. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. He ordered me to go wait in the vendor lounge with the rest of the hired staff until the reception was over, and to use the money in my glass to buy myself a cab ride back to whatever miserable neighborhood I came from. I looked past Harrison, scanning the room. Beatrice Cole was sitting at her table, her arms crossed, a smug, satisfied smile resting on her face. She was thrilled to watch her husband publicly execute the threat she had made in the garden. I looked up at the sweetheart table. Sierra was staring at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but she did not say a single word. She did not grab the microphone. She did not tell her father-in-law to stop. She just watched in terrified silence, choosing her aesthetic and her fake status over her own blood one final time. I looked back down at the soaked $20 bill floating in my champagne glass. I did not feel an ounce of humiliation. I did not feel the crushing weight of their rejection. I only felt the cold, hard certainty of a woman who holds the executioner's axe. I slowly reached my hand into the crystal glass. The cold champagne coated my fingers as I pinched the wet paper and pulled it out. I carefully placed the soaked bill flat onto the pristine white tablecloth, smoothing out the wrinkled edges with my thumb. Harrison let out a short, dismissive breath, assuming my silence was submission. He stood up straight, adjusting his suit jacket, fully expecting me to grab my purse and scurry out the back door in tears. He turned his head, preparing to walk back to the dance floor as the conquering hero of his own pathetic story. He had no idea that I was not getting ready to leave. I was getting ready to stand up. I pushed my chair back from the tiny, wobbly table. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floor, a sharp and grating sound that cut perfectly through the suffocating silence of the ballroom. Harrison Cole took a step back, crossing his arms over his chest. He stood tall, a smug grin plastered across his face, fully expecting me to turn around and walk through the swinging kitchen doors in absolute shame. He expected me to disappear into the background exactly like the hired help he had just compared me to. Instead, I stepped out from behind the table and walked directly toward him. Harrison's smug grin faltered as I closed the distance. He shifted his weight, clearly confused by my trajectory. I did not stop. I did not lower my eyes. I walked right past him, my shoulder brushing inches from his expensive tailored suit. He instinctively reached his hand out, opening his mouth to bark another degrading order, but the heavy scrape of a second chair stopping him cold. Malik had stood up. Malik did not say a word, but he took one deliberate step forward, his dark eyes locking onto Harrison with a silent, terrifying promise. Harrison swallowed hard and dropped his hand, letting me pass. I walked down the center of the massive dance floor. 300 of the city's most elite socialites, corporate sharks, and old money heirs watched me in absolute stunned silence. The heavy crystal chandeliers cast a bright, unforgiving light on my emerald green dress. I felt every single pair of eyes on me, but I had never felt more powerful. I walked with the slow, measured cadence of a woman who completely owned the ground beneath her feet. I headed straight for the elevated stage at the far end of the room. The sweetheart table sat there draped in white silk and overflowing with imported orchids. Sierra and Julian watched me approach, their faces frozen in matching expressions of sheer panic. Sierra gripped the edge of the table so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white. She leaned forward as I stepped up onto the stage, her voice dropping to a frantic, desperate whisper. She begged me not to do this. She pleaded with me to just leave the room and stop embarrassing her in front of her new family. I did not even look at her. I bypassed her completely and reached across the pristine white tablecloth. My hand closed around the sleek metal of the secondary microphone resting next to Julian's untouched champagne flute. I picked it up and turned around to face the massive ballroom. I stood directly above my sister and her new husband, commanding the highest vantage point in the entire venue. I tapped the top of the microphone twice with my index finger. The sharp, rhythmic thud echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, ringing clearly in every corner of the room. Harrison had finally spun around on the dance floor. He was staring up at me, his face flushing a deep mottled purple with absolute outrage. He raised his own microphone, preparing to scream for his private security team to drag me off the stage. I did not give him the chance to speak first. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice was completely calm, smooth, and laced with a terrifying authority that instantly commanded the room. I looked directly down at Harrison and asked him a very simple question. I asked him why he had spent the entire evening nervously pacing the dance floor and frantically checking his gold watch. I asked him if he was sweating because he was desperately waiting for the cavalry to arrive. I let the question hang in the air for a fraction of a second before twisting the knife. I asked him loudly and clearly if he was stalling for time because he was waiting for the CEO of Apex Holdings to walk through those doors and save him from federal prison. The reaction in the ballroom was instantaneous. The name Apex Holdings sent a massive visible shockwave through the crowd of corporate investors and banking executives. Several men sitting at the tables nearest to the dance floor physically jolted, exchanging wide-eyed, panicked glances. They all knew exactly who Apex Holdings was. They knew it was the most ruthless, heavily capitalized private equity firm in the state. And more importantly, they suddenly realized that the rumors of Harrison Cole's financial insolvency were entirely true. Harrison's face went completely pale, but his staggering, foolish pride refused to let him back down. He was trapped in front of his wealthy peers, his new daughter-in-law, and his elitist wife. He could not admit weakness. He could not admit that a woman he had just publicly degraded knew the intimate, terrifying details of his crumbling empire. He gripped his microphone tightly and puffed out his chest, completely taking the bait. He decided to double down on his own fabricated reality. His voice boomed back through the speakers, dripping with defensive arrogance. He proudly confirmed that he was indeed waiting for the CEO of Apex Holdings. He puffed himself up further, taking a step toward the stage, and loudly declared that the CEO was a very close personal friend of his. He lied to the entire room, claiming that he and this mysterious CEO played golf together at the country club and that they had a scheduled meeting tonight to discuss a massive, highly lucrative merger that would solidify the Cole family legacy for the next century. He sneered at me, raising his chin in a pathetic display of dominance. He told me that his powerful friend would be absolutely disgusted to see a low-class ghetto liability standing on the stage, and he ordered me to put the microphone down before I ruined a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. I let his voice echo and fade into the vaulted ceilings. I let every single person in that room absorb the absolute magnitude of his lie. I looked at Beatrice Cole, who was nodding along with her husband's words, completely secure in their fake wealth. I looked at Julian, who was sitting just inches behind me, his chest puffed out with the same unearned pride as his father. Then I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile that contained absolutely no joy. It was the smile of a predator watching the trap completely snap shut. I brought the microphone back to my lips. I told Harrison that it was incredibly fascinating to hear about our close personal friendship, especially considering the fact that I do not play golf. Harrison froze. His brow furrowed in deep, visible confusion. His brain was desperately trying to process the words coming out of my mouth, but his inherent prejudice made it entirely impossible for him to connect the dots. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, waiting for a punchline that was never going to come. I did not break eye contact with him. I projected my voice, ensuring every single syllable was perfectly articulated and impossible to misunderstand. I told the room that my name is not just the sister of the bride. I stated my full name, Maya Jackson. I paused, letting the silence stretch tightly across the ballroom before delivering the final devastating blow. I formally introduced myself to Harrison Cole and his 300 elite guests as the sole founder, majority shareholder, and acting chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was a physical, suffocating vacuum. It was the sound of a decades-old, pretentious legacy shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Harrison actually dropped his microphone. It hit the polished wooden dance floor with a loud, piercing screech of audio feedback that made several guests wince and cover their ears, but Harrison did not even flinch. All the color, all the arrogance, and all the false bravado violently drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, trembling mask of absolute horror. His knees actually buckled slightly, his hands reaching out to grab the back of a nearby chair just to keep himself standing. He was staring directly at the black woman he had just tried to banish to the kitchen. He was looking at the woman he had threatened with security in the garden. He was looking at the woman his son had tried to silence with a non-disclosure agreement. And in that terrifying world-ending moment, Harrison Cole finally realized that he had spent the entire weekend viciously humiliating the one and only person on Earth who literally owned his entire life. The ballroom erupted. It was not the polite, muffled murmuring of high society gossip. It was a cacophony of absolute unfiltered panic. The wealthy investors, corporate sharks, and banking executives Harrison had spent the entire evening desperately schmoozing were now pulling out their cell phones, frantically dialing their risk management teams and financial advisors. Chairs scraped violently against the polished hardwood floor as people physically shifted away from the dance floor, distancing themselves from the Cole family, as if poverty and failure were highly contagious diseases. Harrison clung to the back of a dining chair, his knuckles turning completely white. The sheer magnitude of his public execution was tearing his mind apart, but his arrogant survival instincts kicked in. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed at the top of his lungs that I was lying. He yelled to the panicked crowd that this was an elaborate, malicious prank orchestrated by a bitter, jealous woman who was obsessed with destroying his son's wedding. He desperately tried to rally his wealthy friends, insisting that I was just a low-level scam artist trying to extort his family. He demanded that the venue security arrest me immediately for slander and corporate espionage. I did not raise my voice to argue with him. I did not need to defend my identity or scream to be heard over his pathetic unraveling. I simply lowered the microphone to my side, made eye contact with Malik across the room, and gave him a single deliberate nod. Malik was already in motion. He did not call for security. He simply picked up his heavy leather briefcase, bypassed the panicked guests, and walked directly to the audiovisual control booth at the far edge of the ballroom. The frantic wedding planner tried to step in his way, but Malik gave her a look so deeply terrifying that she instantly stepped aside and raised her hands in surrender. Malik opened his briefcase, pulled out a sleek silver laptop, and plugged a bypass cable directly into the main projection console. The massive high-definition screens suspended from the vaulted ceilings suddenly descended with a quiet mechanical hum. These were the exact screens Sierra had insisted on renting for thousands of dollars to display a romantic, heavily edited slideshow of her relationship with Julian. The ballroom lights automatically dimmed, drawing every single eye upward. But the screens did not show childhood photos or engagement portraits. They flashed blindingly white, illuminating the dark room before displaying heavily redacted but unmistakable legal documents in stark, high-definition black ink. I raised the microphone back to my lips. My voice echoed over the frantic whispers, cold and entirely steady. I told the crowd that numbers do not lie, and they certainly do not care about old money aesthetics. I directed their attention to the first slide. It was a formal notice of foreclosure on Harrison's flagship commercial tower downtown, stamped with a bright red seal from the state banking authority. I narrated the financial collapse in real time. I walked the entire ballroom through the brutal mathematics of his ruin. I explained how Harrison had secretly over-leveraged every single brick of his grandfather's legacy to cover his catastrophic gambling losses and terrible real estate investments. I pointed out the exact dates he had defaulted on his massive commercial loans, proving to his peers that he had been lying to their faces for the past 3 years. Harrison screamed for someone to cut the power. He lunged toward the AV booth, his face soaked in sweat, but Malik stepped out and stood firmly in his path, crossing his muscular arms over his chest. Harrison stopped dead in his tracks, entirely too cowardly to physically confront my chief operating officer. I signaled Malik to change the slide. The next document was a comprehensive financial audit showing a completely flatlined corporate account. I looked directly at the banking executives who had been laughing at Harrison's cruel jokes just an hour ago. I informed them that the man who had just served them imported caviar could not even afford the delicate white orchids decorating their tables. I revealed the incident from the bridal suite that very morning. I told the crowd that Harrison's elite platinum credit cards had all been maxed out and completely frozen, leaving his new daughter-in-law to beg me to pay the working-class floral designer so her perfect wedding would not be ruined. Sierra let out a loud, strangled sob from the sweetheart table. She buried her face in her trembling hands, her massive diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as her entire fabricated world crashed down around her. Julian was staring at the massive screens, his mouth hanging wide open, looking at the undeniable proof that his promised $2 million trust fund was entirely non-existent. Beatrice Cole, who had threatened to have me dragged out by police just hours prior, was now physically hiding behind her extravagant floral centerpiece, shrinking away from the judging stares of her wealthy friends. Harrison was hyperventilating. He tugged violently at his collar, desperate for air. He turned back to the crowd, his voice cracking as he tried to spin one final desperate lie. He shouted that the documents on the screen were forged. He claimed I had hacked into his private servers and manufactured the massive debt just to embarrass him in front of his peers. He pointed wildly around the luxurious ballroom, sweeping his arm toward the crystal chandeliers and the heavy silk drapery. He screamed that a bankrupt man could never secure a venue like the Grandeur Estate. He demanded the crowd look around the room, using the very building we were standing in as his ultimate undeniable proof of wealth and status. I let out a slow, chilling laugh. The sound echoed through the speakers, cutting straight through his pathetic, flailing defense. I told Harrison that he was absolutely right. A bankrupt man could never secure a venue of this magnitude, not without a very specific, highly calculated intervention. I signaled Malik one final time. The massive screens shifted instantly. The complex legal documents vanished, replaced by a single undeniable image. It was a high-resolution scan of a massive cashier's check. It was the exact deposit check Harrison had written to the estate management 2 weeks prior to secure the ballroom. Stamped aggressively across the front of the check in thick, unyielding red ink were the words, "Insufficient funds." I looked down at Harrison, who was now trembling so violently his knees were physically giving out. I explained to the entire ballroom that his deposit check had bounced higher than a rubber ball. I told them that the venue management had immediately drafted a formal cancellation notice and was preparing to lock the heavy iron gates on this entire wedding 14 days ago. I paused, letting the silence stretch tightly across the room, making sure every single guest was hanging on to my next words. I told Harrison that the only reason those doors were open tonight, the only reason he was eating gourmet food and drinking vintage champagne, was because the silent owner of the Grandeur Estate had personally intervened. I told him that the owner had explicitly instructed the management team to waive the deposit, ignore the bounced check, and let the Cole family proceed with their elaborate fake production. Harrison stared at me, his eyes wide and completely vacant. His brain finally connected the final devastating dots. The arrogance entirely left his body, replaced by a crushing, suffocating realization. I leaned into the microphone, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I told him that I did not waive his deposit out of the goodness of my heart. I told him I waived it because I wanted all of his creditors, all of his investors, and every single person he had ever lied to, gathered in one single room when I finally dropped the guillotine. I told him that I own this estate. I own the ground he is currently standing on. And as of this morning, when my acquisition team finalized the paperwork, Apex Holdings officially owns his entire rotting company. The absolute finality of my words hung in the air, a heavy executioner's blade that had finally severed the thick rope of their deception. For a moment, nobody moved. The entire ballroom was frozen in a massive tableau of sheer shock. The soft clinking of silverware stopped. The quiet whispers completely ceased. And then the illusion of untouchable old money wealth shattered completely, violently and irreversibly. Julian Cole had been standing near the edge of the sweetheart table, holding a crystal champagne flute halfway to his mouth. The glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the edge of the elevated stage and shattered into dozens of jagged pieces, sending expensive vintage champagne splashing across the pristine white floor. Julian did not even look down at the mess. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and locked entirely on his father. The carefully styled, charming groom persona evaporated into thin air. The terrifying reality that his entire inheritance was a fabricated lie finally pierced through his thick skull. Julian let out a guttural sound of pure, unfiltered rage. He lunged off the stage, his polished dress shoes slipping slightly on the spilled champagne, and charged directly across the dance floor toward Harrison. He did not ask his father for an explanation. He did not try to pull him into a private hallway to save face in front of their wealthy guests. He grabbed Harrison violently by the lapels of his custom Italian suit jacket, bunching the expensive fabric into his fists, and slammed him backward into a nearby dining table. Silverware clattered to the floor. Half-eaten plates of gourmet food crashed onto the hardwood. The guests sitting at that table leaped out of their chairs, scrambling backward in absolute terror as the Cole family patriarch and his newlywed heir began physically brawling like desperate street thugs. Julian screamed right into his father's face, his voice cracking with high-pitched hysteria. He demanded to know where his money was. He yelled that Harrison had explicitly promised him a $2 million trust fund the exact second he signed the marriage certificate today. Julian shouted that he had only gone through with this massive, exhausting wedding production because he was guaranteed financial independence. He shook his father violently, demanding the trust fund, screaming that he was supposed to be set for life. He called his father a fraud, a liar, and a pathetic failure in front of every single corporate investor Harrison had ever tried to impress. Harrison was completely cornered, stripped of his power, and publicly humiliated beyond repair. His survival instincts mutated instantly into vicious, uncontrollable cruelty. He did not apologize to his son. He did not try to calm him down or offer a rational explanation. Instead, Harrison brought both of his hands up and violently shoved Julian squarely in the chest. The force of the shove sent Julian stumbling backward. He tripped over the leg of a fallen mahogany chair and crashed hard onto the polished wooden floor, his tailored suit jacket ripping loudly at the shoulder seam. Harrison stood over him, his face twisted into an ugly, sneering mask of pure contempt. He pointed his finger down at his own son and yelled with enough force to make his voice carry without the microphone. Harrison screamed that Julian was nothing but a useless, entitled leech. He shouted that Julian had never worked a single hard day in his entire life, that he had contributed absolutely nothing to the family empire, and that he was nothing more than a constant, exhausting drain on their dwindling resources. Harrison told the entire ballroom that he had spent the last 10 years funding Julian's lavish vacations and expensive sports cars while the real estate company was secretly bleeding to death. He yelled that Julian deserved absolutely nothing because he was nothing. Beatrice Cole let out a piercing shriek from her table, covering her face with her hands, utterly destroyed by the public spectacle of her husband and son tearing each other apart like wild animals. The high society guests who had previously praised Julian's noble character were now whispering frantically, some even pulling out their cell phones to record the spectacular downfall. Security guards began rushing into the ballroom, but they were hesitant to physically intervene in a fight between the supposed hosts of the event. I stood perfectly still on the stage, the microphone resting quietly at my side, watching the destruction unfold with absolute cold detachment. Malik walked up the steps and stood right behind my shoulder, his presence a silent wall of protection, his eyes scanning the chaotic room to ensure no one approached me. I looked over my shoulder toward the sweetheart table. Sierra was still sitting on her elevated platform, but she was no longer the radiant, confident bride she had been just hours ago. She looked like a terrified ghost. Her flawless makeup was completely forgotten as she stared down at the dance floor, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. She watched her new husband sitting helplessly on the floor, looking pathetic and weak. She watched her father-in-law screaming like a deranged madman, entirely unhinged and bankrupt. The terrifying, inescapable reality of what she had done finally settled over her shoulders like a suffocating lead blanket. Sierra had spent the entire morning bragging about marrying into American royalty. She had rejected our mother's vintage pearls because she thought they were too cheap for her new luxury aesthetic. She had signed a non-disclosure agreement to hide her working-class roots. She had allowed these people to mock my background, and she had treated me like a disease she needed to eradicate from her life. She did all of it because she believed the Cole family name came with sprawling mansions, private yachts, and endless corporate credit limits. But she had just signed a legally binding marriage certificate with the state. She had officially tethered her entire future, her credit score, and her legal identity to Julian Cole. And Julian Cole was tethered to a family that was drowning in millions upon millions of dollars of insurmountable toxic debt. There were no mansions. There were no trust funds. There was only foreclosure, bankruptcy courts, and federal financial audits. She realized in a blinding flash of horror that Julian was not going to provide for her. He was going to drag her down into a financial abyss she could never climb out of. She looked down at the massive, ostentatious diamond tennis bracelet Beatrice had given her that morning. The same bracelet she had proudly shoved in my face to assert her new dominance. In the harsh, unforgiving lighting of the exposed ballroom, the diamonds suddenly looked like exactly what they were. They were an unpaid debt. They were stolen goods, bought on credit. They were a heavy, glittering shackle tying her to a rapidly sinking ship. Sierra's lower lip began to tremble violently. A loud, guttural sob ripped its way out of her throat. It was not a delicate aesthetic cry meant for wedding photographers. It was the raw, ugly sound of a woman who realizes she has completely destroyed her own life through sheer greed and arrogance. Hot tears spilled over her eyelashes, instantly ruining her perfect contour, leaving dark streaks of waterproof mascara running down her flushed cheeks. She looked frantically around the massive ballroom, realizing that every single person in the room was either a ruined member of the Cole family or a wealthy stranger who was currently laughing at their demise. She had absolutely no one in her corner. She had alienated her friends, she had abandoned her heritage, and she had just married into absolute financial ruin. Her frantic, tear-filled eyes darted wildly across the room until they finally locked onto me. I was standing tall, composed, and completely untouchable on the stage. I was the silent owner of the estate. I was the CEO of the company holding the executioner's axe over her new family. Just hours ago, I was the embarrassing older sister she wanted hidden away by the portable restrooms. Now I was the billionaire savior she desperately needed to rescue her from her own terrible choices. Sierra did not hesitate. She abandoned her new husband on the floor. She abandoned her ruined father-in-law and her shrieking mother-in-law. She grabbed massive handfuls of her heavy, incredibly expensive designer wedding gown and hoisted the thick layers of silk and tulle up to her knees to keep from tripping. She scrambled off the elevated platform, nearly falling over the hem of her dress as her heels hit the lower floor. She hit the dance floor running. She shoved past two stunned waiters and pushed her way blindly through the crowd of whispering guests, entirely uncaring of the massive spectacle she was causing. Her designer heels clicked frantically against the hardwood as she sprinted away from the wreckage of the Cole family. She was sobbing openly now, tears streaming down her face, her chest heaving as she ran directly toward me. She was running toward the woman she had spent the entire day trying to erase, desperately hoping that my unconditional loyalty was still intact, praying that I would open my wallet and save her from the nightmare she had just legally married into. Sierra crashed into the edge of the stage, her heavy silk gown bunching up around her knees as she scrambled up the steps. She reached out with trembling hands and desperately grabbed my bare arm. Her manicured nails dug into my skin as she looked up at me, her flawless bridal makeup completely ruined by a flood of panicked tears. The vicious, entitled bride from this morning was entirely gone. The girl who had sneered at my emerald dress and demanded I sit by the restrooms had vanished. In her place was the manipulative little girl who always knew exactly how to play on my sympathies. She looked up with wide, tear-filled eyes, and called me her big sister in a sickeningly sweet, pleading voice. It was a title she had refused to use all weekend, a title she had actively tried to hide from her new in-laws. She begged me to fix it. She clung to my arm and frantically whispered that I had enough money to make this entire nightmare disappear. She pleaded with me to just buy the debt to pay off Harrison's massive loans so she could save face in front of her sorority sisters. She actually believed she could convince me to finance my own abusers, just so she could keep her country club membership and her fake high society lifestyle. She thought my wealth was just another resource for her to exploit to maintain her aesthetic illusion. I looked down at her hands gripping my arm. For 20 years, whenever Sierra cried, my immediate instinct was to protect her, to absorb her pain, and to sacrifice whatever I had to make her smile. But in that moment, looking at the greedy, superficial stranger she had become, I did not feel an ounce of that protective instinct. The well of my unconditional loyalty had finally run completely dry. I reached down and firmly grasped her wrists. I did not yell and I did not rush. One by one, I forcefully but calmly peeled her trembling fingers off my skin. I pushed her hands back toward her chest, severing the physical and emotional tie between us with absolute finality. I kept my voice low, but the microphone was still active at my side, broadcasting my absolute rejection to the silent, captive ballroom. I asked Sierra if she remembered the morning of her sophomore year of high school. I watched her eyes dart nervously around the room as I reminded her of the day her prestigious private school tuition check bounced. I reminded her how she had cried on the kitchen floor, terrified that she would lose her rich friends if they found out we were struggling. I told her exactly how I fixed it that day. I told her I walked into a pawn shop in the pouring rain and sold our mother's gold wedding ring. I sold the only piece of our parents' marriage I had left, the only thing of value I owned, just so she could walk the halls of that elite academy and pretend she belonged. I looked directly into her crying eyes, my voice hardening into steel. I reminded her of what she had said to me in the bridal suite mere hours ago. I reminded her that she had shoved our mother's vintage pearls into my chest and called me a cheap working-class embarrassment. She had told me I was a bitter spinster ruining her aesthetic, and she had demanded I learn my place. I declared loudly and clearly so the entire room could hear that she had finally gotten exactly what she asked for. I told her she was a married woman, now completely independent and entirely tied to the Cole family legacy she wanted so desperately. I announced to the room that I was officially resigning from my position as her financial safety net. She had chosen her path, she had chosen her new last name, and now she had to pay their debts. Sierra let out a devastating, breathless wail. She collapsed onto the steps of the stage, burying her face in the folds of her ruined designer dress, finally understanding that she had burned the only bridge that could have saved her. Watching my absolute refusal was the final trigger for Harrison Cole. He realized in that exact moment that his last desperate manipulation had failed. There would be no secret bailout from the sister of the bride. There would be no corporate mercy. He was entirely irreparably ruined, and his fragile, arrogant ego shattered completely. Harrison snapped. He let out a primal, guttural roar of pure, desperate rage. He shoved past a terrified waiter, knocking a silver tray of champagne glasses to the floor, and charged directly toward the stage. His hands were balled into tight fists, his face contorted into a mask of violent fury, aiming straight for me. He did not even make it within 5 feet of the platform. Malik moved with terrifying speed and flawless precision. He stepped out from behind my right shoulder, intercepting Harrison's wild charge effortlessly. Malik did not throw a punch. He simply grabbed Harrison by the lapels of his ruined Italian suit and the heavy leather of his belt, utilizing the older man's own reckless momentum completely against him. Malik spun Harrison around with brutal efficiency and slammed him hard against the edge of the nearest mahogany dining table. The heavy table slid back a few inches with a loud screech. Crystal centerpieces toppled over, spilling water and white orchids across the floor as Malik pinned the disgraced patriarch face down against the wood. Malik leaned his weight onto Harrison's back, completely immobilizing the flailing man without breaking a single drop of sweat. Malik's voice was deadly calm, hovering just above a whisper, as he advised Harrison to stay exactly where he was unless he wanted to leave his son's wedding reception in the back of an ambulance. Harrison gasped for air, his cheek pressed flat against the spilled food on the tablecloth, completely humiliated and entirely powerless. Beatrice Cole screamed her husband's name from across the room, but she was too terrified of Malik to step forward. Before Harrison could even attempt to struggle against Malik's iron grip, the heavy oak double doors at the back of the grand ballroom slammed open. The loud booming sound drew the attention of every panicked guest in the room. The general manager of the estate marched into the ballroom. He was no longer playing the role of the polite, invisible hospitality host, catering to the whims of the elite. He walked with absolute authority, his spine straight, and he was not alone. 10 massive, highly trained security guards, dressed in immaculate black suits with coiled earpieces, filed into the room behind him in a synchronized formation. They moved swiftly and silently through the parted sea of terrified guests. They completely surrounded the dance floor, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of muscle between my elevated stage and the ruined Cole family. The guests backed away, giving the security team a wide berth as they secured the perimeter. The general manager stepped up to the front of the security formation. He completely ignored Julian crying on the floor, Sierra sobbing on the steps, and Beatrice screaming in the background. He looked down at Harrison pinned helplessly to the dining table, then looked up at me standing untouched on the stage. He offered a slight respectful bow of his head and calmly asked me how I would like to dispose of the trespassers. I looked at the general manager. He stood perfectly straight, waiting for my command. I raised the microphone to my mouth one final time. I told him to escort Harrison and Julian Cole out through the kitchen service exit, exactly where Harrison had tried to send me. I told him that if they resisted, he was to call the police and press formal trespassing charges. I lowered the microphone and gave a quick, decisive signal to the audiovisual technician in the corner. The soft, romantic uplighting that bathed the ballroom in a warm, golden glow was instantly killed. A second later, the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent house lights slammed on, flooding the room with a blinding, clinical brightness. The illusion of the grandeur estate was completely stripped away, revealing the terrified, panicked faces of 300 high society guests. I brought the microphone back up and announced that the wedding reception was officially terminated. I advised everyone to locate their coats and exit the premises immediately, warning them that anyone remaining in the ballroom in 5 minutes would be considered an accomplice to Harrison Cole's corporate fraud. The reaction was absolute pandemonium. These were the elite, the old money billionaires and corporate sharks who spent their entire lives avoiding scandal and financial ruin at all costs. To them, poverty and bankruptcy were highly contagious diseases, and Harrison Cole was patient zero. They did not walk toward the exits. They practically stampeded over each other. Women in designer gowns shoved past waiters, abandoning their expensive silk purses and crystal champagne flutes on the tables. Men in tailored tuxedos scrambled for the grand double doors, not even stopping to say goodbye or offer a single word of sympathy to the family they had just been toasting. They were desperate to distance themselves from the spectacular collapse of the Cole empire before the financial shrapnel could hit their own reputations. On the dance floor, the security guards moved in with flawless military precision. 2 massive guards grabbed Harrison by the arms, hoisting him off the dining table. His custom Italian suit was smeared with chocolate cake and spilled wine. He was no longer screaming. The fight had completely left his body, replaced by a vacant, hollow shock. He did not even look back as the guards dragged him forcefully through the swinging kitchen doors, forcing him to walk past the very catering staff he had insulted all night. 2 other guards scooped Julian off the floor. The groom was weeping openly, dragging his polished shoes across the hardwood as he was escorted out the exact same humiliating back exit. Beatrice Cole did not wait to be grabbed. She snatched her expensive clutch from her table, covered her face with her hands to hide from the glaring house lights, and practically ran out the side doors in absolute crushing shame. Within minutes, the sprawling, opulent ballroom was completely empty of guests. The only people left were the venue staff quietly clearing tables, my security team Malik and me. And standing right in the middle of the massive empty dance floor was Sierra. She was entirely alone. Her heavy designer wedding gown was soaked in spilled champagne and stepped on by fleeing guests. She looked around the ruined ballroom, her mascara running down her face in thick black streaks, watching the debris of her shattered fairy tale being swept up by the janitorial staff. I did not walk down from the stage to comfort her. I did not offer her a ride home. I handed the microphone to Malik, picked up my clutch, and walked out of the ballroom through the private VIP exit, leaving my sister standing completely alone in the wreckage she had chosen. The next morning, the sun rose bright and warm over the city. I was standing in the kitchen of my luxury penthouse wearing a silk robe and sipping a freshly brewed cup of dark roast coffee. The absolute silence of my home was a stark, beautiful contrast to the screaming chaos of the night before. I felt a profound, incredible sense of peace settling deep into my bones. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried on my shoulders since I was 15 years old was completely gone. I was no longer the exhausted older sister sacrificing my life to fund an ungrateful sibling. I was just Maya. My peaceful morning was interrupted by the sharp buzz of the intercom panel on the wall. I walked over and pressed the button. The lobby concierge sounded deeply apologetic. He informed me that my sister was standing in the lobby with 4 massive suitcases demanding to be led up to my penthouse. I took a slow sip of my coffee, looked at the sweeping city skyline, through my floor-to-ceiling windows, and told the concierge to send her up. A few minutes later, the private elevator chimed, and the doors slid open directly into my foyer. Sierra looked absolutely terrible. She was wearing a pair of expensive designer sweatpants and a rumpled silk blouse. Her eyes were swollen and red from crying all night. She dragged 4 heavy, oversized luxury suitcases out of the elevator, dropping them onto my pristine hardwood floors with a loud, careless thud. She did not say hello. She did not offer a single word of apology for the horrific things she had said to me in the bridal suite, or for allowing her new family to abuse me all weekend. She simply crossed her arms and launched into a frantic, demanding complaint. She told me that the hotel management had literally locked them out of their $10,000 honeymoon suite at 3 in the morning. When Julian tried to use his credit cards to book another room, every single one of them was declined. His accounts were frozen, his trust fund was a lie, and the Cole family estate was currently surrounded by aggressive creditors. Sierra aggressively stated that she refused to sleep in Julian's cramped childhood bedroom with his screaming parents. She pointed toward my hallway and demanded that I have my housekeeper prepare the guest suite for her immediately because she was moving in until she could figure out how to annul the marriage. She truly believed that after everything she had done, she could just walk back into my home and resume her free ride. She thought my boundaries were temporary. I did not argue with her. I walked away from the foyer and headed straight to the sleek oak desk in my home office. I opened the top drawer, pulled out 2 small items, and walked back to where she was standing. I held out my hand. Sierra reached out eagerly, expecting me to hand her the spare keycard to my penthouse and a stack of emergency cash. Instead, I placed a folded piece of printer paper and a blue plastic card into her palm. Sierra looked down, deeply confused. She unfolded the paper. It was a printed real estate listing for a tiny, cramped studio apartment located in a working-class neighborhood on the far south side of the city. The rent was cheap, the appliances were old, and there was absolutely no aesthetic to be found. The plastic card was a standard pre-loaded city bus pass with exactly $50 of fare on it. Sierra stared at the items, her jaw dropping in absolute horror. She looked up at me and asked if this was some kind of sick joke. She yelled that she could not possibly live in a neighborhood like that, and she certainly did not ride public transportation. I kept my voice incredibly calm and completely void of any sympathy. I told her that she was the one who wanted to be a high society elite. I reminded her that she had spent the entire weekend bragging about her independence and her new wealthy status. I explained to her that true high society, the kind that actually lasts, requires absolute self-reliance. It requires building your own empire, not just marrying into a fake one and expecting your sister to foot the bill when the lies collapse. I told her that my home was a sanctuary, not a rehabilitation center for ungrateful people who only loved me when my wallet was open. I told her the free ride she had enjoyed for the last 10 years was permanently over. She was officially a married adult, and she was going to have to figure out how to survive in the real world without my black card shielding her from the consequences of her own actions. Sierra opened her mouth to scream the familiar tantrum brewing in her chest, but I did not give her the audience she wanted. I stepped back into my apartment, grabbed the heavy brass handle of my solid oak front door, and began to close it. Sierra panicked, dropping the bus pass and lunging forward to catch the door. She pleaded with me, her voice cracking as she begged me not to leave her out there alone. She cried that I was all she had left. I looked at her terrified face through the narrowing gap. I told her that she should have thought about that before she left my chair empty at the altar. I pulled the door shut until the heavy deadbolt clicked firmly into place, cutting off her frantic sobbing. I stood in the foyer for a moment, listening to her pound her fists against the thick wood demanding to be let in. I did not waver. I did not reach for the lock. The sound of her crying did not break my heart anymore. It just sounded like the echo of a past I was finally walking away from. I turned my back on the front door and walked through my quiet, beautiful penthouse. I stepped out onto my expansive wrap-around balcony. The morning air was crisp and refreshing. I leaned my hands against the cool glass railing and looked out over the sprawling city skyline. I could see the towering commercial buildings I had funded, the neighborhoods I had helped develop, and the empire I had built with my own 2 hands from absolute scratch. For years, I had allowed the guilt of our mother's passing to anchor me to a sister who viewed me as nothing more than an ATM machine. I had suffocated under the immense weight of carrying her ungrateful expectations, constantly shrinking myself to make her comfortable in a world she did not earn. But standing on that balcony, breathing in the fresh air, I felt the pure, unadulterated freedom that comes from finally setting down a burden you were never meant to carry forever. Cutting off toxic family is brutal. It goes against everything society tells us about blood and loyalty. But I learned the hard way that loyalty is a two-way street, and blood does not entitle anyone to abuse your grace. I want to ask you all a question. Have you ever found yourself completely exhausted from carrying the weight of ungrateful family members? Have you ever had to make the terrifying decision to cut off someone you love because they demanded your absolute loyalty while offering you nothing but blatant disrespect? It is one of the hardest things you will ever have to do. But I promise you the peace waiting on the other side of that door is worth every single tear. I would love to hear your stories and your experiences in the comments below. Let us build a community of people who know their worth and refuse to settle for less. If my story resonated with you today, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who might be struggling to set their own boundaries. Thank you so much for watching, and always remember that walking away from toxicity and creating ironclad boundaries is not selfish. It is the ultimate expression of self-love.